Hello everyone, so today in this video I figured since the last time I really went into Bouncer and its PA usage and rotations was, well, a really long time ago, like before we even got Mars. And so I decided I'd make a video to talk about the Soaring Blade's photon arts and their applications during combat. I'll probably leave out jet boots related stuff here, primarily because jet boots these days are mostly delegated to Fierce Wave and Jet Tube Jolt duty than anything else when it comes to using soaring blades, with the occasional jet boots intensity and boots weapon action. With that being said, I will probably talk about them for a bit anyways because they still play a part in using soaring blades. Anyways, basically I will go over all 4 PAs and what tech arts customizations are worth using from a Soaring Blade's main weapon perspective, and go over the situations for where you'd either want to shift into PAs and what rotations you'll want to use. I'll also be going over Blade Arts Parry Sidestep, or BAPS as I'll be calling it from here on out again, because it's really important as far as upping your damage on Soaring Blades go. This won't be a complete guide because the one I made earlier this year still holds up pretty well, bar some technique usage, lack of Mars, and no TACS for destructive Stork. So if you want a full breakdown, I recommend watching the video on screen that hopefully I will edit in. Let's be honest, I'll probably forget. So first off, let's go over BAPS, or again, Blade Arts Parry Sidestep one more time. Essentially, this is a mechanic with soaring blades that basically allows you to pull off 2 counters off of a single attack by making use of the parry mid-photon art and your sidestep counter simultaneously. The best photon art to pull Blade Arts Parry Sidestep off with would be Roaring Pheasant. This is a PA which upon use will move forward in whatever direction you are facing for a few seconds before ending the PA with a final powerful slash attack. This attack is the best way to set up BAPS, provided you aren't disengaging each time to set it up. Don't do that, that's a big no-no. Usually if you have to approach the target and an attack's coming your way, you can set up BAPS pretty easily by doing a Blade Arts parry followed by a sidestep counter almost immediately after. You can also BAPS with Rampaging Harrier, but it's a lot more difficult due to the animation lock and the lack of armor on the PA. Harrier is also a lot more PP heavy compared to Pheasant, and messing up will be costly as a result. If you absolutely need to BAPS out of Harrier, the best attacks to do it on be ones with lingering hitboxes. Basically attacks that can hit you for multiple times during a single attack. If you absolutely need to BAPS out of a Harrier, the best attacks to do it on be ones with lingering hitboxes. Basically attacks that can hit you for damage multiple times because the hitbox of the attack lingers for a bit. The entire rolling animation of Pheasant by comparison lets you activate BAPS for that whole portion of the PA up until the final slash. It also has armor for the full duration of the PA, up until the slash attack of course. There are also ways to extend the time of the roll part by the means of technique art customs, which is something to keep in mind for when you need to set up BAPS where the boss has a delayed attack. The end result of course is you deal far more damage than you would simply using BAP on its own, and you restore PP by pulling it off too. A good way to practice BAPS would be dual phase 3, as a majority of Zelvin's attacks can be BAPSed off of. Did I just create a new word? Oh boy. Can't be as bad as Grand Jed Jeeper. Yeah, that was it. Right? That was the meme. Also, since this is part of the core loop of Bouncer, we also have Phantic Blade and Pinion Blade for cooldowns on Soaring Blades. These 2 cooldowns are pretty vital to both Soaring Blades' overall damage output on downs and or PP restoration, so let's get into those 2 since these also play into your photon arts. First off, we have Pinion Blade. This is a 2900 potency cooldown that has a relatively long windup in exchange for dealing a singular hit that deals massive damage to any targets in its radius. Pinion Blade's hitbox is actually extremely misleading, and it actually covers a lot of distance in every direction from which it is used, giving it some usage for mobbing and by extension cleaving multiple targets. Upon use, you also restore a large amount of PP, making it very useful for both damage and sustain. You should also for the most part always have this ready to use off cooldown, since the gauge to use Pinion Blade is built by using PAs and it has a 30-second cooldown. Next we have Phantic Blade, which is the second cooldown Soaring Blades needs to keep track of, though not really because it's just on a timer. Phantic Blade basically adds additional damage to your weapon action counter as well as every PA. Basically something like Roaring Pheasant won't really gain much from Phantic Blade because the photon blades come out a bit late, but Pinion Blade, Raving Falcon, and Rampaging Harrier will overall gain more DPS due to when the extra photon blades come out during the animation itself. In the case of Raving Falcon, you can do counters If you can do counters, it keeps up with Harrier during Phantom Blade for DPS. These photon blades also restore PP when they hit the target, making this also a very useful tool for PP sustain as well as additional damage. So we've gotten the core mechanics that you'll be using alongside PAs down, so let's actually get into the photon arts and which TACS you should grab. First off, we have Destructive Stork. Destructive Stork is a filler photon art typically used to shift into from Harrier whenever you are unable to finish the blade rain portion of Harrier, which is basically second half of that particular PA. Stork, upon shifted into, will basically slightly elevate you and deal damage in an upwards motion quickly before slightly de-elevating you. Of course, if you take type 2 Stork, you will not de-elevate or descend, I guess. Stork, upon shifted into, will basically slightly elevate you and deal damage in an upwards motion quickly, making it better to use over Harrier's blade rain animation because that particular portion of Harrier is pretty weak and the enemy can move out of its otherwise long animation. The unshifted version of Stork was granted a unique TAC recently, which essentially gives it the choice between increased AoE, increased attack speed, or a unique dot effect at the end of the PA. By the way, the increased attack speed is specifically for the shifted version of the PA. Ideally, this dot version of the unshifted PA is what you'll want to use because it has no impact on the shifted version of Stork's damage, while also only needing 5 ticks roughly from the dot to get the most out of that TAC. It also places a massive AoE circle where the PA ends, meaning it can be used for mobbing, and unless the boss can completely shift around it, like Solus when it does its 360 turn, most bosses are basically unlikely to move out of Stork's hitbox, which is really nice. As an added bonus, it's pretty easy to BAPS out of shifted Stork. From there, we now have Rampaging Harrier. In many cases, Harrier can be seen as your bread and butter for Soaring blades. In many cases, you will be using this PA as your primary source of damage to build Pinion Blade gauge. Of course, there are also times where it's actually more efficient to use Roaring Pheasant over Harrier, but the majority of you out there, this is the main PA that you will be using while the boss is active. The first half of this PA simply slashes at the target a few times, ending off with the blade rain portion mentioned earlier on. Generally speaking, while it's weak, it's not the worst thing ever to let the full animation play out. However, you need to be wary of the boss's positioning because it's a DPS loss if the boss moves out of that portion of the PA. To rectify this, you can shift out of here before the blade rain if you feel this will happen. You have 2 ways to react based on how the enemy is about to move. For example, if the boss is about to simply pull away from the attack and become untargetable, you can shift into Destructive Stork or also shift into Harrier. If the boss moves a relatively far distance away, you can shift into Raving Falcon the gap close, or again, shift into Harrier. If the boss simply moves a short distance away and you can still hit it with the next PA, you'll just want to shift into Harrier and then go back into using, I guess, Harrier. If the boss simply moves a short distance away and you can still hit it with the next PA, you'll want to use the shifted version of Harrier, which will simply throw the blade raid portion of the PA at the target rather than have it drop down on the target itself. Knowing what PA to shift out of when using Harrier is a really important thing to note, as there will always be times where you won't be able to finish all of Rampaging Harrier. The ability to shift into different PAs allows you to react accordingly, which is honestly great and allows for a lot of versatility. Harrier is just one example of that. Harrier is an extremely simple for its TAC, as you'll want to take the attack speed TAC. It's pretty much the only one worth taking in the first place because the other one basically just adds super armor and the other one increases damage on downs, which the attack speed is overall just a better choice because increased attack speed usually, in most cases but not every case, translates to a DPS increase, and Harrier is no exception to this. Next we have Roaring Pheasant, which we touched up on earlier. Pheasant, as mentioned before, is your main PA for setting up BAPs. However, there will be times where it's more efficient to use unshifted Roaring Pheasant over Harrier as your main PA for dealing damage. A prime example of this would be for Dark Falls Dalian, where the fragments remain stationary for essentially the whole phase. This allows you to easily use Pheasant by not locking onto the fragment and facing it directly, allowing you to hit the fragment with every hit from unshifted Pheasant. It also, by extension, allows you to easily pull off BAPs. Keep in mind this only works because you are using Pheasant against a wall, so you won't be going past the fragment. This is why you don't see unshifted Pheasant used very often and only for specific cases. That aside, unshifted Pheasant also has one other use as an opener to pretty much every boss fight where you have to approach the boss. I also mentioned earlier how there's a rolling animation that ends with a final strong slash, right? Well, you can also use this to pre-fire on every boss that you have time to approach, as I mentioned, and line the attack up so that the final slash at the end of the PA will hit the boss. This is generally more efficient than simply dashing up to the boss or opening up with Raving Falcon to gap close. Seriously, don't do that. This pre-fire works on pretty much every instance boss fight in the game, Solus included, so keep that in mind. There's also the shifted version of Pheasant, which hits several times in place from where you shift. This version of the PA is very seldom used, if at all these days, so it's best to avoid using it. There's a TAC that increases the amount of hits, which while it is consistent, it isn't as useful as taking the other two TACs for Pheasant, which are centered around the unshifted version of the PA instead. The first TAC extends the duration and basically the distance traveled of Pheasant, while the third TAC extends the amount of gauge you gain for Pinion Blade. I don't know why that was so difficult to talk about. Talking is hard. Anyways, use TAC 1 whenever you need the extended unshifted Stork duration, or TAC 3 if you want more Pinion Blade gauge gained from Pheasant. Finally, we have Raving Falcon. This is the only Soaring Blade PA as of this video to not have a TAC. However, let's get into it anyways. Rampaging Harrier both serves as an immediate gap closer and a ranged damage PA. While under Blade Fantic, Raving Falcon is an option that is just as strong as Harrier, provided you can counter it with Blade Art's parry. The shifted version will allow you to gap close to whatever target you are locked onto. There really isn't much to say here, as Falcon's use is very specific and very simple, but it's still a solid PA for the right moment overall. So we've pretty much already explained rotations and what PAs to shift into and so on, but let's break it down so it's simpler to understand for those little Timmies out there. First off, we have Destructive Stork. If the boss is mostly stationary, use Unshifted Stork for dot and then use Harrier after placing the dot. If the boss moves, you want to shift accordingly into one of the following. For Rampaging Harrier, if the boss remains in one spot, let the full animation play out. If the boss is about to come untargetable, shift into Stork or use Shifted Harrier. If the boss is about to move a far distance away, you shift into Raving Falcon to gap close, or you can shift into Harrier. If the boss moves out of where the blade rain will come down, you want to simply shift into Harrier. For Roaring Pheasant, if you are approaching the boss, use Unshifted Roaring Pheasant a fair distance away before contact. If the boss is untargetable and not moving, use Unshifted Pheasant, with no lock-on of course, against the target. It should be noted that, as I also mentioned earlier during the BAP segment, this is mostly only applicable during Dalian's Fragments and Solus's Pod and Rod, and requires you not to lock on, making positioning extremely important. Also, it's a lot harder to use Roaring Pheasant on the Solus Rod, so keep that in mind. As for Raving Falcon, if Fantic Blade is up and the boss is using a lot of ranged attacks or moving a lot, use Falcon over Harrier. Generally speaking, this is the process in which you will use your 4 PAs on Bouncer for the average encounter. One of the most important things you can do is study a boss to know how the fight works, as these rotations can change on a per boss basis. Nothing is ever exact. Some examples of this include Malignant Solus during Phase 2, where you have to keep track of how much of what PAs you can squeeze in before Solus pulls away from the field again. While this guide provides examples of what each PA does and how you can react during each PA, a lot of instant quests built around large bosses play out very differently and encourage you to play more aggressively or play very differently than normal. Finally, we have Jet Boots PAs, and by that I mean pretty much just Fierce Wave and Jet Sweep Jolt, which isn't even a PA. I'll just make this simple because it's really simple. Basically take Fierce Wave, the Phase Wave TAC that extends the duration in which the shockwaves of this PA last to build Jet Sweep Jolt gauge faster, so you can pull off more Jet Sweep Jolts. If the boss is relatively stationary, you can set this up during downtime where the boss isn't attacking you and build up gauge so you can get additional damage from using Jet Sweep Jolt off cooldown. There are also some fights with lingering hitboxes like Solus, where you can use Blade Art's Parry's sidestep into a Jet Boot's weapon action press into a Soaring Blade's weapon action counter, like the Solus targeted lasers in Phase 1, to pull off 3, technically 4 counters during one attack. The Jet Boot's weapon action also reduces the cooldown on Jet Sweep Jolt and builds gauge, meaning you can't target the boss, but the boss is still attacking you. You can use the weapon action on Boots to build gauge and or reduce its cooldown timer. So with that said, we've pretty much covered everything as far as Soaring Blades and its general loop goes. It's actually not hard to deal lots of damage on Soaring Blades because it's just that strong of a weapon on its own. But when you start maximizing each attack the enemy throws at you, you can increase the damage you have even further. That'll basically be it for this mini guide of sorts. If you have any further questions or I missed something, please let me know because I am sick and maybe I missed something while writing the script. Anyways, I'll be happy to explain anything I did miss. There's honestly quite a bit to cover about this particular weapon, so it's pretty easy for me to miss stuff. Thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next video.